Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David Novak. I have voices talking just outside the window, and they've been going for quite a while, and one never knows what that might lead to. It's possible that there will be movement in the hallway and that might set the dogs off. But I decided not to wait. I've been waiting and not to wait any longer. This is going to be sort of a discursory video, again, most probably touching on a variety of different things. I'm going to talk somewhat about my four cardinal poets. This will be going back to my experience with the muse or with writing poetry. I won't be talking about the muse particularly. I have a video which does that. I recently did a video about E. Cummings, and he was one of my four horsemen, if you will. So I will talk about the four. But what led me into this thought was a question that I had, and it was, I believe, M.D. Yee who asked, well, I answered in the comments, but did not answer everything sufficiently, I think. So I will just expound a little bit here. I was wondering, since I just discovered your channel, whether you read much fiction / non-historical fiction like horror. If so, do you have any book recommendations? If not, do you have any poetry recommendations for someone who has just started reading poetry and has a difficult time understanding poems? Thanks. So the first part of that was about any fiction that I read or non-historical fiction. Since I've been on YouTube, I've been documenting what I read. So I have a recent reads segment which talks about the last 3 or 4 books that I have been reading. In some cases fiction, in some cases non-fiction. And I have a video in which I discuss my entire last year's reading, the year 2022, in which I read, of course, a combination of fiction and nonfiction. But I don't read fiction according to any plan. It's just whatever happens to float my fancy at the time, or I may have some ulterior motive of some kind. Perhaps there's a booktube event going on that I want to try to align with somewhat. I wish I could be reading more fiction. My heart tends to be with nonfiction. The one thing that I scarcely ever read anymore is poetry, in contrast with the title of my booktube channel, which I don't particularly feel like changing. But I've had occasion a couple of times to talk upon matters poetic, and I feel I've had a kindly response. And so in this case, I will talk a little bit. But to get the first question out of the way about do I read? I don't read any genre fiction like horror. Were I to recommend, the only horror that I think I've ever read has been Edgar Allan Poe, and he gets a strong recommendation if a person is looking for horror. I read some of his poems early. I had one famously in a high school class, and it was on a test, and I still have the test, and we had to interpret the poem, and it was a horrible exercise for me. It's the poem to Helen. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore. Of course, I was a high school lad who had no idea what the heck he was talking about. I didn't know Helen. I didn't know Nicaean barks of yore. I didn't know the glory that was Greece or the grandeur that was Rome. I didn't know any of that. I was very poorly educated. So it was awful. And so I don't particularly recommend Poe's poetry unless something grabs you. Obviously, The Raven is indispensable for an American at least. And I've always had a particular fondness for The Bells, but some of the poems are a little bit weird. So we'll set Poe aside at this point. Now, going on to poetry recommendations for someone who has just started reading poetry and has a difficult time understanding poems. I want to say I am not a teacher. I'm just a person who has been involved to some degree with poetry, English verse, American verse, for 5 decades or 50 years. And so I inevitably have thoughts and am happy to share my thoughts, but none of it can be considered in any way instructional on my behalf. I don't come up with lists of, say, the 10 classics you must read, the 10 books of poetry that you must read, the 10 poets. I don't actually believe in any of that sort of thing as it pertains to poetry. My view with poetry is that, well, less is more, that you are better with one Shakespeare sonnet fully understood or fully assimilated into your very being than the whole book of 154 just cursorily skimmed. So the same thing applies to number of poets, quantity of poets. There is no real need to read every English poet under the sun. If your reading inclines you to 2 or 3 poets, why, that is quite possibly sufficient. I've known many people who have lived their lives that way and taken solace, taken inspiration, taken a bit of reflected philosophy from a handful of poems that they perhaps learned when they were very young, and then coming perhaps to retirement age want to delve into that more deeply. It seems perfectly acceptable to me. There's no reason for a total immersion. My comparison is with the study of Tai Chi. I studied a bit of Tai Chi when I was very young and was aghast when I learned that people considered it an old person's exercise. There goes the buzzing and somebody coming in. But now that I myself am on the elderly side of the spectrum, I think that that viewpoint is perfectly feasible. It is not for most of us in our youth to study Tai Chi as though we were someone in a temple on the route to becoming a master practitioner. And so poetry in the normal person's life need not have the central focus that it has happened to have in mine. So I don't make any suggestions with the idea that I think you should do what I did, say, in order to become like me. I would actually not advise that. But having said that, a little background might be helpful to a person who is thinking about the own course that they might be inclined to travel. And I answered this question by saying that the book, I mentioned that, say, the person who wants to learn sushi, they go and enlist with a sushi master, and the word is escaping me right now. It was in the answer that I gave, apprentice. And they get accepted, and the sushi master says, your first 10 years will consist of nothing but making rice. The rice is very important, and you have to learn how to get that right. And I said, in the case of poetry, particularly where not being able to understand poems is an issue, I recommended Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience by William Blake, and I said I would start here, and I would focus on this book for 5 years, after which time, after 5 years of reading these poems, then you will be ready to branch off into your own direction, and whatever you do, it will not be a mistake. Now, I've thought about this a little bit more, and I realized that this book has that poem about the little black boy, which is a little bit of a problem for readers of our generation. Now, Blake was a good man. He was an abolitionist, but he was a man of his time, and so the poem presents a scenario in which the little black boy professes that to become a little like a little white boy is the be-all and end-all. Well, I'm distorting the poem a little bit, but it has been taken in that way. I believe at least one book has been written focusing particularly on that poem. It was never a favorite poem of mine. You will find poems that are your favorite, that you go back to and back to. And similarly, you will find poems that are more understandable and less understandable. The lyric that starts, it's 2 stanzas, and the first is, Father, Father, where are you going? Oh, do not walk so fast. Speak, Father, speak to your little boy, or else I shall be lost. That is an immediately accessible couple of, four lines, I guess, and no interpretation need to be brought to it. Now, the second stanza, or the second half of the poem, it is a little bit less easy to follow for the novice. And so that brings me to the other point, which I wanted to stress, which is that if you are new to poetry, understanding what is in the text is quite possibly the least of your concerns. You don't really need to understand what's happening in a poem. That may come with time, yet again, it may not. And so there are poems in here which are varyingly accessible. Again, you come across a line like something about a sigh or sighs that a sigh that runs in blood down palace walls. Well, if you're looking for somebody to tell you what that means, you're going to get a very constricting explanation. You're going to get somebody who puts it into a little box, and you don't need that. And so my paramount advice really is to take your time. And 5 years is just something off the cuff. You yourself can determine what you need, but I can pretty well tell you that 5 years spent on this book would not be time wasted, at least in terms of making progress in reading and understanding poetry. When I started poetry, I recognized this sometime later, there were 4 poets that had been my initial foundational poets. And so I'm referring to them as my cardinal poets. There were 2 that I got on my own, and there were 2 that I got through school. Now, there was the high school class I had, and in that class we were given a number of poets, including Erica Jong, and most of them did not speak to me at all. But E.E. Cummings did, and Emily Dickinson did. Now, before either of those, quite possibly, or around the same time, I was reading Robert Service. Now, I knew about because I believe my grandmother had a book. She had 2 books of poetry, or possibly 3. I think Francis Thompson was in there as well. And I think one of them was a book by Robert Service. If not, he was a poet that my mother knew. And so I picked these up while I was fairly young and very much a novice in poetry. And this falls on the verse side of T.S. Eliot's famous distinction between poetry and verse. And it was always the best of, and then the more selected. And in youth, I was never able to find the original selected. So there are a couple of poems duplicated. And these poems still mean a lot to me, but keep in mind that I never go back to poetry. And then the 4th major voice, of course, was Blake. I'll show you my I had this in a mass market paperback, and it eventually needed replacing. These are kind of my trifecta, my 3 important books. Although in all 3 cases, it is not something, I've read these books entirely, but I would not go back to everything entirely. I was very specific. Keats has his 10 poems or whatever that are the masterpieces. He has various attempts at epics that did not work. A poem called Lamia, which is not really considered among his best, at least did not feel so to me. I've seen people regard it as such, but and then John Donne, I've tended to prefer and to go back most frequently to the earliest lyrics, but then you have the sonnets, and you have some longer poems. I think they're called elegies, and so those also became very important to me. And then a lot of religious poems, which while I've read them, they're not the sort of thing I go back to. And then Blake, this book, you have songs of innocence and of experience, and you have notebook poems and little incidental writings that really remained important to me. But a lot of his longer poems, which are kind of weird, are not stuff that I tend to go back to. Now they have their diehard fans. And that's how it is with the study of poetry. Each poet is heeding his own drummer, if you will, and going off in his own direction. And you may not be equally enthralled with all aspects of a poet's career, and that is perfectly fine. If there is one poem by a certain poet that you love and you don't like any of the others, why then just read that one poem. Don't feel any sense of obligation to read the rest. I mean, an obvious case for me would be Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. I've looked at the rest. I can't say that I've read everything through. Probably I have not. But that one poem has done it for me. So when I am telling somebody to get William Blake, now he did very lovely illustrated editions of his books. He was a printer, and this is an Oxford edition. I don't know that it's still published, but in its day, it was really the first time that suitable four-color printing editions of his work were possible. I assume that you can find them anywhere now. But here again, I would say having his illustrations is not really all that important if your focus is the poetry. So this book has the text. So on the opposite side of either of these will be the illustrated version that Blake did. I like the fact that the text is in red simply because it reminds me of in the old days in the Bible when the words of our Lord Jesus Christ were in red. But besides that, I would rather actually have the text in black ink, which is easier to read. Now, I am just as inclined to grab the Penguin book to get Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. And if you spend years devoted to that book, again, without checking secondary sources, without reading about it, without having a teacher tell you anything about it or what it means, without knowing anything about the historical context, you will come away with a pretty secure footing in poetry. Now, of my four, I believe that I was very lucky to find both of these very early. So Robert Service and E.E. Cummings, one of my early sonnets has something in which I mention both of them because they were both genuine talents and sincere practitioners of the art. And so for a young person trying to learn the craft, that is more essential, that sincerity, than any kind of ability to perform all the fancy bells and whistles that might be pleasing to teachers. Come on. But I mentioned that these are where I started, and they are neither of them a place where I would recommend for you to start. We all have our own humble origins, and while I love the work of both men dearly, and even more than that, I love the sort of figure of the poet, especially as in Cummings, but I love the integrity with which they went about their task, respectively. In my own case, I came to a point where I realized that I had to go past that, if you will. One can think of all kinds of stories, say Picasso being taught how to paint by his father and then at some point going beyond his father. Now, I'm not making a comparison with myself to Picasso, but it is inevitable that we all come from diverse backgrounds, and what draws us into poetry will have its own distinguishing features. And so this is not a place that I recommend anybody start. Now, these other two, well, let me get the fat book, Blake and Dickinson. I always felt a certain consonance between their works, because there's a certain roughness around the edges that I found and still find very appealing. When you go to one of the great masters like Shakespeare, not to say that these are not great masters, but Shakespeare, or I'm trying to, Keats, everything is absolutely flawless. The meter is perfect. The literary allusions are apt. Not to say that these poets are deficient in any way, but I think that they are very approachable. Now, Cummings meant a lot more to me in a big way, whereas Dickinson, even though I credited her early with having saved my life and was reading her poetry from an early time, I was not trying to pattern myself after her in any respect, and I very much was patterning myself after Cummings. And the reason that I would suggest to somebody this book instead of Dickinson is because a lot of this is accessible in a way that some of this may not be. Now, this is, I think there's something like 1,700 poems in here, and they have varying levels of appeal as well, just as any poet's work will. And the thing for this, particularly if you're an American and you're very comfortable with not understanding what you read, then I would say go for this for your 5 years apprenticeship if you like. Either one, or probably even both. I think that either one is a writer who will not lead you astray. And in the case of Dickinson, for many years I read poems and I did not understand what she was talking about. And they seemed so out there, so abstruse, so hard to get. The vocabulary is just beyond comprehension. And then at some point, age 50 maybe, I crossed a line, and all of a sudden everything just made a lot more sense to me. But once again, the thing is with reading poetry, you cannot expect it to make sense. That part of its function, I believe, is helping to build us up to its level. I doubt that anybody is born being able to read John Keats. And let me talk a little bit about Keats. He's known for his one living year. It was a year in which just fantastic writing occurred. He was his oeuvre, his work, is not devoid of the incidental masterpieces before, but it is certainly not consistent, and it is certainly not everything. So in a book of Keats, you might be better approaching from the standpoint of a selected at first. The unfinished epics or big poems, some people love them, and they may work their magic on you. They've never had the same effect on me, and so I've barely gotten through them. The poems from that living year are a different matter, and I came to Keats really upon the heels of William Blake. I'm sure, again, I had these in mass market paperbacks, and all I knew when I was getting them was that they were Penguin classics, and they were complete poems. I mean, and I will speak a little bit more about that and say that they are also really well annotated. You don't necessarily need them, but the annotations in these editions will not hurt you. But the thing about Keats is that Keats is less accessible. You tend to start with the odes. There's a handful, maybe 5 or 7 odes. And to a person who has never read poetry before, it is not easy going. It's like climbing a tall peak. And in the end, you are rewarded for the effort. He has a good number of little sonnets that are also worth your time and attention. But what I wanted specifically to talk about was his great poem about the Eve of St. Agnes, which it's a 42 stanza poem written in the Spenserian stanza. You don't need to know the Spenserian stanza. It was a stanza form invented by the poet Spenser, and it's sort of a complicated pattern of 9 lines. So it's a heavy stanza. Nobody since Spenser ever carried it off. Is it Byron who did Childe Harold? He tried, but he didn't carry it off. And the Keats poem, the Eve of St. Agnes, in its 42 stanzas, handles the form marvelously. But my experience when I read that poem was, I read the first day, I got up to 21. I got halfway through the poem, and I fell back exhausted at that point. And if I had not had the motivation to continue, I might well have left it there. But I was, having had my encounter with the Muse years before, I was motivated. And so the second day, the next day, I picked it up again. And again, with the strenuous effort, I made it through to the tail end of it. And then, of course, the day after that, I read it all the way through. And you get to a point then where you are familiar enough, and you can go through a poem like that you know somewhat without feeling sheer and utter exhaustion. But that was what I felt. It was, you know, if the odes were the equivalent of climbing a large hill, then it was climbing a much higher peak. And indeed, I was spiritually, mentally, and I would guess probably also physically exhausted at the end of it. But eventually you build up some stamina for it. So I wanted to share that. And I thought on top of that, I would share with you just the first stanza to another poem written in the Spenserian stanza form, 9 lines to a stanza. And this is the Parrot of Baghdad by E.H. Palmer. I believe it's a translation of something by Rumi, perhaps. But in order to fit it into the framework of a Spenserian stanza, changes were doubtless made. But in its own right, it is a lovely poem, and I will give you the first stanza to that, The Parrot of Baghdad. In far-famed Baghdad, in a druggist's shop, there lived a parrot, such a clever bird that passengers in the bazaar would stop to hear him. He could utter every word of the first chapter. I have even heard that the imam was seriously vexed because the parrot's reading was preferred to his own services on this pretext, that Polly threw so much more feeling in the text. So that's E.H. Palmer. I don't particularly recommend the rest of his work. It's interesting in its way, but I did like the Parrot poem, and that gives you a sense of the stanza, which anybody who is just starting to read poetry, you don't really have to know much about the fancy names of forms. You don't need to know the names of the poetic devices, which is what my high school teacher called them. You had to know the difference between a simile and a metaphor. That was on a test. You had to know onomatopoeia, I think. You had to know allusion. You had to know assonance and consonance. You were tested on all of this stuff. It's not really anything that you need preoccupy yourself with. And so it's also one of the reasons that you should avoid reading too much secondary matter about a poet or the poetry, especially when you are starting out, because oftentimes people don't have that much to say or don't know what to say, and so they focus on certain areas, such as those which they have in common with other scholars. The whole realm of scholars can zero in on these hot button words, simile, metaphor, and know what is being talked about. But for the casual reader, or even for the serious reader who is not interested in approaching poetry from an academic vantage point, none of that is necessary, or it's not necessary until it becomes necessary, and you will know when that is. Nobody likes reading criticism more than I do, and critics get into the nitty-gritty of some of these technical terms, and for me, it's candy. But it is only something that I have developed a taste for. And of course now, I really don't read poetry very much. The thing, when you spend a good amount of time with a book such as Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, that gets inside of you. Certain of Blake's poems I have memorized either in whole or in part without having even tried. And so it inveigles its way into your system, into your mind, almost as a virus, to use our popular term now, or a meme. And that is how you want poetry to work. At one time when I was younger, I thought if every copy of Keats had been lost, I don't know that I could have written his major odes out line for line without any errors, but I think I could have come to a approximation. You find prepositions and stuff like that that are kind of very hard to pin down. But I felt confident enough that I could reproduce the major odes by Keats. I would not be so confident at this point. I doubt that I could. But as I say, certain bits and pieces of Blake remain in my memory. So I don't know if I need to do any summing up. You have Cummings and Service, who were brilliant for me when I needed them. And I believe I grew beyond Cummings at a certain point. I don't think I ever grew beyond Robert Service, if you want light verse, but there's only a very, very few poems that I love without reservation. There's nothing wrong with loving a poem with reservation. So both of these poets, I am very selective about. When I was making recordings of poems for my channel 3 years ago, I did not just open the book and read every poem. I read poems that had meant something to me particularly, and that I still felt a lasting impact of. Now, other poems that I recorded at different times were things that I just pulled out of anthologies, or because I found it amusing. So those were my first two horsemen, or my first two cardinal poets. And then you have Dickinson and Blake. And that's how it went with me. Of course, I love Keats dearest of all, but he did not make it into that initial group of four. I had to have some stamina built up by then. So I think that probably covers all I needed to say, more than I perhaps planned on saying, and almost assuredly more than you may have wanted to hear, but I will leave it there. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.